Welcome, everyone, to the fourth season of the Ecopolitics podcast. This is a podcast for university students interested in environmental politics. And it has been quite a while since we did season 3, hasn't it, Peter?
I totally agree, Ryan. It's been over 2 years since we recorded our last episodes, and we made 36 episodes in the first 3 seasons of the Ecopolitics podcast. So I'm super excited to be starting the 4th season, finally. And I just want to say to our audience, it's been so good to be producing these podcasts for university students, though we have had many others who are not university students listening in and giving feedback too. And the first 3 seasons have prompted a lot of questions and discussion in our classrooms and in other classrooms. And we've had some great feedback from people who really liked certain episodes. I think really appreciated that we brought a diversity of voices to the podcast. We had guests from Africa. We had Black, Indigenous, and people of color voices from around North America and beyond. Bringing perspectives into the classroom that certainly you and I couldn't do. And that really led for rich discussions in the classes, I just got to say. We've had feminist voices and others on the podcast. And so I'm looking forward to continuing to do that, continuing to bring diverse voices forward. It's worth noting that we started recording this podcast in the latter days of the first Trump presidency in the United States. He was presiding over the COVID pandemic and the pandemic response in the U.S. I'm chuckling a bit because it was rather tumultuous how he presided over that. And those were, frankly, turbulent times in U.S. politics and in global politics. And isn't it interesting that here we are in the very same week that Trump, we're the first week in November as we record this episode of 2024. He just won the presidency in the U.S. again, and it looks like the U.S. is heading in for some more turbulence as a result as well. And so it's going to be interesting to see how all that plays out in the coming months. So let me put this to you, Ryan. What do you see has changed since the last time we were recording this podcast?
Well, I think you're right that the election of Trump is an example of some of the political and economic changes that we've seen in the last couple of years since we did the last few seasons of the podcast. And these in turn are kind of a manifestation of the pandemic that we had at the very beginning of this podcast. So maybe a lot of listeners don't know that the podcast really was kind of a product of the pandemic. We had this calamitous global event, and the world kind of ground to a halt, and it really affected the university sector and teaching, and everything went online. And there was these cool grants that were being offered for learning opportunities that you and I pitched a proposal to put together a online learning product, and that's what the podcast was originally. And then we got more funding and it kept going. And I think we produced, 3 really solid seasons and some great episodes. I think another thing that's really changed even in just the last couple of years is just we're seeing the incredible impacts of climate change around us ever present. This year is turning out to be most likely another record-breaking year after last year, 2023, which was earth-shattering, record-breaking warmth. And, we've seen in social media all kinds of crazy climate impacts and just catastrophic severe weather events, which are just eye-opening, jaw-dropping. And one of those big ones was the record wildfire season we had last year in Canada. So, things have indeed over the last couple of years been really tumultuous in the world of both the environment and the politics and the political relations that stem from that, both globally and here in Canada. So that's an opportunity for me to turn back to you, Peter, to ask, what kinds of themes are we going to be expanding upon in this season that maybe we started to develop in the first couple seasons of the podcast?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think the theme is continuity and change in events that are happening around us. And then there's definitely also some continuity in the podcast, just take this as an example. In season 1, we really focused on Canadian environmental politics, We did some really important episodes on environmental justice in Canada, environmental law, corporate social responsibility, and a lot more. And some of what we covered in those episodes, I'm finding in the classroom, like they continue to speak well to the current dynamics. But other things have shifted.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that we bring folks up to date on some of these, shifting political grounds. And as one example, we had an episode in season 1 with Catherine Harrison and Andree Olive, in which they unpacked with us federalism and Canadian environmental politics. And they specifically brought in, a lot of that dynamic that they talked about, the relationship between federal Canada and the provinces and territories and how that affects environmental policy continues to be relevant. But the example they brought up of the carbon tax continues to be a political hot potato. And we've really seen that come back to the front burner of politics over the last year, I would say, with the Conservative Party, now led by Pierre Poilievre, really running with this axe the tax agenda. And, the polls are all pointing to the idea that his party may very well become the next governing party. And thus, the progress, some of us might say, on developing a carbon tax in Canada might get stalled or dismantled. And that's the kind of issue that I think we have to keep following and see how that's playing out. So what do you think we should be doing on that front, Ryan?
Well, we definitely will be doing an episode on the carbon tax and the politics surrounding it, specifically in the Canadian context right now. But I do hope that we discuss the politics of carbon pricing more broadly. And I'm really excited to speak with a couple experts on this and suss out maybe my own theory right now, which is that I think we're starting to see something new in the erosion of political support for the carbon tax in Canada. And what strikes me as different is that since the beginning, there was opposition, and they had this famous cover page for Maclean's talking about, the resistance to the Trudeau Liberals' carbon tax. But what strikes me as new is that we're starting to see an erosion of support from allies of this policy, the kind of people that you would expect to have supported this. So one example of that is in the province of British Columbia, where the Premier David Eby was, basically saying, look, we know that this policy is kind of unpopular. And so signaling if the Conservatives come to power or if this carbon tax is repealed, that we're also going to do that here in the province. And there's a couple other examples. So that for me is something I want to suss out with the experts and see if, my pet theory is right there. But as you noted, this is a super politically contentious issue right now. It's defining a lot of climate politics in Canada, and again, really hoping to speak with some experts to help us sift through that story with a Canadian context.
And the interesting thing, Ryan, is the pushback isn't just in Canada, right?
Yeah.
One of the episodes we did in season 2, it was an episode called Dairy Cows, Climate Change and Settler Colonialism, Insights from Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
And in that episode, we interviewed Hugh Campbell from the University of Otago and John Reid from the Naitahu Centre at the University of Canterbury. And one thing we highlighted was the way that Māori environmental perspectives were starting to have an impact on mainstream thinking in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And we brought in the example specifically of sort of a collaborative governance process that was happening in New Zealand a couple of years ago called He Waka Eka Noa, which is a Maori proverb that means we're all in this same boat without exception. Like we're all in this together. And that process brought together industry stakeholders and government and Maori rights holders to design a levy, which was like a mini carbon tax, specifically targeting agricultural greenhouse gases. So that's methane, also nitrous oxide from fertilizer use. And there is also some carbon dioxide produced in agriculture, but the big one is methane, right? From cows, burps and farts and sheep and so on. Mm-hmm. And the intention was that collaborative governance process would design a levy or a kind of a tax, a greenhouse gas tax for the agricultural sector, which emits 50% of that country's greenhouse gases. So that's kind of a big chunk of their GHGs.
And how has that kind of changed? I know you're working on a project on that very specific issue. So how are things changed?
Yeah, yeah, good question. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, the reality is that not unlike in Canada, there was a lot of pushback from the right, the political right, on the idea of a tax on agriculture to address its greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, the process, the He-Waka-Kanoa process, fell apart in late 2023, in part through election dynamics, and a new center-right coalition emerged there, led by a conservative-like National Party and another two other coalition partners, and they basically abandoned the whole process. So there is not going to be this levy, at least in the near future, on agriculture in New Zealand. So I would like to do an episode on that where we kind of dig into what happened with that process and why did it fall apart, especially because I'd like to compare it to another context. Perhaps Denmark comes to mind, where they have developed a tax on agricultural greenhouse gas emissions just in the last year. So Aotearoa, New Zealand, it looked like they were going to be the first. It didn't happen there because of the sort of similar political dynamics that we're seeing in Canada. And yet another context, Denmark, did. And so, I think there's an interesting conversation we can have in both of these episodes that we're talking about, the tool itself of taxation or greenhouse gas taxation as a way to incentivize change and penalize destructive behavior. Is it the right tool, and in what contexts? In agriculture, there is a legitimate debate, just to bring up the other side. The voices against a tax in New Zealand said, look, it's just going to push production of agricultural goods offshore, right? Like, we're not providing global markets with, in this case, it's often milk powder, produced in very efficient ways on our New Zealand farms. Then somebody else is going to pick that up. And they might actually be less efficient producers and thus more greenhouse gas emitting per kilogram of milk solid or whatever it is. So, there's different sides to these debates about these policy tools. And I really look forward to kind of exploring them in these episodes.
Hmm. Well, I mean, there's some interesting echoes there, right, in the political response to carbon pricing
Mm-hmm.
between New Zealand and Canada, but also some really interesting differences to explore in the sense that in the Canadian context, there, at least in principle, the idea was that carbon pricing shouldn't increase the cost of food, and there's been a lot of debate about that, about whether that's the case. But anyway, so we'll definitely jump into that.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but that kind of gets us on to the other big theme that's been central, really, to the podcast in prior seasons, and going forward in this season as well, which is the politics and the environmental politics of food and agriculture. So, in season one, we talked about how can we define sustainable food systems, and in season two, we had this episode you just told us about in the dairy sector in New Zealand and carbon pricing. And in season three, we did this sort of deep dive on sustainable protein with, guests Paige Stanley and Tara Garnett, and even another episode in that season about local food systems versus this sort of global efficiency and industrial food systems. So it's been a big theme. And maybe if I can ask you, Peter, to tell the audience a little bit about some of the episodes that we're going to be doing in this fourth season about the politics of sustainable food and agriculture.
Well, sure. Yeah. One of the episodes that I'd like to bring to this audience is comes out of a research project that you and I both worked on last year. So we're getting into the stuff we did between these seasons, right? In 2023, you and I, along with several other colleagues, worked to produce a report called A Strategic Framework for Accelerating Sustainable Agriculture in Canada, Recommendations for Philanthropy. And, interestingly, for those who've been listening to the pod, we worked on this under the auspices of the Transition Accelerator, which is a think tank mentioned way back in season 1, episode 2 by James Meadowcroft.
Oh, that's right. I forgot he mentioned that, but yeah, you're right.
And in fact, he was one of our researchers on this project on accelerating sustainable agriculture in Canada. And that report was commissioned by a group of philanthropic foundations in Canada who were curious about how they could use their funding of support for civil society actors. Think of NGOs like Equiterre, the CEO of which we interviewed in season 1, episode 15, as well as researchers and the way they can nudge industry actors to encourage the adoption of more sustainable practices. The reality is that land use change is a huge contributor to climate change and biodiversity loss, and can also be a source of the solutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like good farming practices,
Mm-hmm.
and how you deal with riparian environments and woodlot environments and whatever can make a huge difference on things like biodiversity and climate change.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we got into in this report. We interviewed experts around the country, organized a series of focus groups that you were really involved in some of those focus groups, Ryan, on dairy and beef specifically, I remember, and other protein sources. So that report that we'll put a link for our listeners to the report came out just about a year ago. And I want to follow up with some of our co-authors, with some of the foundation voices, to see what has happened since on that file. What kind of things are moving forward now? Where are the foundations starting to put their money to support this transition to more sustainable agriculture in Canada? And, just as a sort of a bit of a teaser, one of the things that we specifically recommended and that I know is gaining considerable traction right now in Canada for the last few years is this idea of regenerative agriculture, which came up in that interview with Paige Stanley that you referenced earlier on. So it's interesting to see how these conversations have moved forward, and now there's increasing funding going from corporations and philanthropy and government, frankly, into regenerative agriculture as a sector.
Mm-hmm. And I hope we pick up that theme, because there's some really interesting politics happening around regenerative agriculture. Because you're right, it is continuing to resonate in Canada, but also in the United States in a really interesting way. So I just read actually on social media that Joel Salatin, so for those who don't know, he's sort of one of these gurus of regenerative agriculture. He has actually been pitched as a sort of advisor, a potential advisor to the Trump administration's selected nominee for the Department of Agriculture. And what that tells me is that we might have a little bit of what we might call horseshoeing, where there's a sort of this political dynamic where you see aspects of the left and the right kind of bend towards similar types of ideas. So especially in the United States, there's this real kind of, Republican kind of rancher, beef friendly, 100%, U.S. made, a caricature, which is supporting regenerative agriculture, right? It's part of that vision.
Yeah, it's super interesting. The phrase that we've been hearing just the last week quite a bit is "Make America Healthy Again."
Yes,
right, and
yes,
how
exactly.
how this is bringing. Yeah, it's a right wing agenda, but a lot of what it's promoting would be supported by some on the left, right? So it's an interesting time down there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about again how we're going to cover regenerative agriculture and sustainable agriculture in the series?
Well, sure. I mean, one of the other things that's happened over the last couple of years is we just mentioned the podcast interview that I did with Hugh Campbell and John Reid from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm pretty sure that podcast interview was the second time I ever talked to John Reid. I invited him to be on the podcast. And shortly after that, I invited him to be a collaborator on a research grant to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which was successful. And I'll mention a bit about where that's going, because John and I ended up organizing a Wananga, which is a Maori concept of a learning space, in June of last year in Otautahi, which is the Maori name for Christchurch, New Zealand, where we brought together industry executives and Maori leaders and farmers to talk about the Sustainability Transition Challenge in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And what was particularly distinctive about that event, and it fit with that podcast that we previously did, was, a good percentage of the speakers on the stage that day were Indigenous, representing tribal authorities and Indigenous organizations that are taking steps forward on regenerative agriculture, for example, in organic farming and in a whole bunch of areas, indigenous economic development to move because a lot of tribal authorities are heavily invested in agriculture in New Zealand. That was one of the things that we talked about in that podcast. And they recognize that that's got to become more sustainable. So we organized that event in Otatahi in Christchurch last June. And coming out of that, we had the bones of this funding application. Because what we heard at that event is that there are so many cool things happening on the ground where there's a whole move towards recognizing of ecosystem rights in Aotearoa. People may have heard of the Whanganui River being recognized as a legal rights holder. There is a mountain, a national park that also have that designation there now. And those efforts are leading to really cool collaborative dynamics between Maori and non-Maori, non-Indigenous partners on how to kind of put, say, the rights of the mountain or the rights of the land, let's say to put in Aldo Leopold's terms, the health of the land first, as a priority. And this project that we now have going, it's called Living Relations. John and I are the co-directors. And it's about identifying and sharing stories of Indigenous-led food system transition initiatives, both in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in Canada, and bringing those kind of initiatives into dialogue to really share with the world what's going on. And I look forward to bringing some of those stories to our podcast listeners this season.
Yeah, well, I look forward to hearing some of those stories. And, it really conjures up, again, a lot of really interesting interconnections and similarities between the context, the environmental political context in Canada and other places in the world, in particular New Zealand. You mentioned this idea of legal kind of personhood for things like rivers and mountains. And we've got some of that in Canada too, right? With I think it's the Magpie River, right? That's kind of recognized as a legal person here in Quebec.
That's right. And even where we live here, Ryan, along the Tanagodino Zibi, which is the Algonquin name for the Gatineau River, there's a movement to push for legal personhood led by Gilbert White Duck, a former chief from Kitigan Zibi. So, and frankly, those ideas come out of what they've seen happen with the Magpie River in northern Quebec. And those ideas come out of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So, there's a really interesting cross-fertilization of Indigenous-led ideas that are coming into the mainstream in both of these countries and in many other places.
Right. And that's been a big theme for the first few seasons of our podcast. We've done a number of episodes that touch on Indigenous environmental politics in one way or another. So, what kinds of material are we going to bring into this season along that theme?
Well, that's right. And so we will bring in some of the stuff from the Living Relations Partnership, which brings together an array of Indigenous and academic partners from these two countries. And let's just see. I think it's going to come up in some of our other podcasts as well, the role of Indigenous people and perspectives in taking a leadership front in environmental politics. Mm-hmm. So this speaks to some of my research that I've been deeply involved in over the last year or so. And during that time, I have a feeling you've been doing a lot of writing on a book, Ryan. So what's that all about? And how are we going to maybe bring some of those ideas into the podcast?
Yeah, well, for those who are listening in, you're alluding to the book that I have just written while I was on my sabbatical last year. It was a privilege, but also a really incredible experience to take a year not having to work on teaching and just working on this manuscript for this book. So I wrote a book. The book is called The Growth Environment Debate, and it's kind of an introduction to this debate that I kind of see as the foundation of ecological political economy, which is the field of study that I traditionally position myself in. And the book really kind of tries to offer up an explanation of these 5 main discourses in this debate about the future of the relationship between growth and the environment. And so it ranges from the neoclassical economists who argue that growth is really the best way to achieve environmental sustainability, to the other side of the spectrum, which is these, the folks that we hear about saying that growth is is responsible for this trajectory that is inevitably leading us to collapse of civilization. And then there's a couple discourses in between those two extremes. And the book really tries to come to grips with that debate and introduce people to it, but also kind of tease out some of the implications of it. So I do want to do at least an episode, probably 2 episodes on that debate. And I really hope to tell that story through stories. So I have a couple kind of opening anecdotes in each of the chapters that I want to kind of tease out for the podcast listeners to learn about this debate in a different way.
That sounds fantastic, Ryan. And what I'm hearing from you, and I think this is important, like you're really talking about capitalism, frankly, and its relationships to the planet. And can that be reformed, or does it need to be? Even there are perspectives that say it's gonna figure it all out. And this has obviously come up in previous episodes, and we'll continue it this season. And one of the things I like about these episodes that you're going to bring in is that this podcast is about more than just like specific policy choices, like should we have a carbon tax or not. It's about bigger issues and putting today's politics into a longer term perspective about how our societies engage with the more than human world, as David Abram talks about it. And this reminds me about, this is the theme of our 4th season. So drum roll, please.
Right. Yeah, we haven't introduced the theme. So what's the theme of our 4th season?
Well, our listeners probably see it by now because this episode will be titled with it, but it's the politics of the Anthropocene.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, Ryan, what does that title mean for you?
Well, our students will be probably well aware that, the term specifically is meant to convey this idea that humans have had and human activities have had this overwhelming influence in terms of shaping the environmental conditions that serve as a foundation for human civilization. It's this idea that it's a new geological epoch that is defined by human activity. But, it's a contested term. I've got mixed feelings about the term Anthropocene myself. I think, it's become one of these very overused terms, and in some respects kind of has, a different set of meanings depending on who's using the term, right? Like kind of like sustainability. And it's really interesting to me that geologists recently had a meeting where they were trying to decide whether they should officially change the name of our current geological epoch to the Anthropocene, which, if they had approved it, would have ended the Holocene epoch, right, in the last kind of 12,000 years, during which we've had this very stable climate since the last ice age, essentially, and during which human civilization really kind of grew and thrived. But they rejected that, and they said they're not ready to accept this term, which is kind of interesting in political terms as well. But, I think there's no doubt just how significant humans and human activity have been for shaping the conditions of life and shaping our own fate. And in fact, this is now such a pervasive belief that there's a sort of growing notion that humans will have to intervene to save ourselves from the very climate breakdown and ecosystems degradation that we are ourselves doing through things like geoengineering. So we're going to do an episode on geoengineering, and that's what Anthropocene means to me. But maybe I should turn it back to you and ask, what does Anthropocene mean to you?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. For me, the title is less about whether or not the Anthropocene is technically the right term for our geological epoch. I find that, it's an interesting debate, but for me, it's an evocative idea of just how big our human relationship with the more than human world has become. And also just about how unique these times are that we have the privilege, frankly, of living through. We might see this era as so tumultuous, but it's an era of so much change, right? On multiple levels. Like much of what our societies did and our ancestors did to establish themselves over the last few centuries now needs to adjust in big ways, to fit within the carrying capacity of the planet. And I recognize not everybody sees it that way, but I think you and I do. And we also see all around us, and so many of our podcast episodes are showing how new ways of doing things, new ways of designing cities and food systems and transportation and so forth forth is happening, often against pushback, but things are moving in that direction, I would say. Housing and a whole bunch of issues, things are changing. And this is a time of enormous conflict over what those changes should look like. And it's like that kind of scale of change that a term like the politics of the Anthropocene speaks to. And actually, this makes me think about another theme that I want to bring to our podcast this season.
Which is?
Well, we have the scales of change taking place and tensions around them, and this can be really destabilizing to people. Consider the mental health costs, for example, of climate change. Like the 2022 IPCC report was the first one of their reports to directly talk about the mental health impacts of climate change. And it discussed those impacts not just in terms of the mental health of those people who are displaced by fire or floods or other forms of climate impacts, but also the impacts on people who increasingly feel overwhelmed, maybe helpless, increasing losing faith in their governments who are supposed to be leading us through these challenging times, and yet sometimes seem to be hiding from the issues. And those mental health impacts, those latter impacts, are especially felt among young people, like the students we have in our courses. And I feel that sometimes in the discussions we have in the classroom. And I think that in the podcast, I would like to kind of address that directly. And one of the ways that I want to do that is have an episode or two, we'll see what it works out, on building our inner resilience, our internal capacity to take on the challenges of the world, which frankly are huge, with clarity and with courage. Confidence is another word that comes to mind, just when they feel so challenging. And I'm calling this kind of taking a mindful approach to ecopolitics. And that's because I can think of quite a few people, both activists and specifically mindfulness practitioners, who have been kind of thinking about these things for a long time. One person that comes to mind, there's a Buddhist environmental activist, Joanna Macy, who's been writing since the 80s. And she and a co-author, Christopher Johnstone, a few years ago, put out a book called Active Hope. And the subtitle of that is How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. And what they're really talking about is borrowing from long-standing wisdom traditions like Buddhism, and there are many other traditions out there that one can draw on to get grounded. If you think about, just as examples, Martin Luther King's activism in the 60s, Gandhi's activism in the 50s and 60s, these were people who brought about enormous change for the positive, I would argue. And they did it not from anger, but from really being grounded, knowing what was right, and taking the time to nourish themselves as they nourish their movements for change. And so I want to spend some time really thinking about how we do both of those things, how they can complement each other, so that we don't burn ourselves out as we're trying to prevent planetary burnout, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, and that makes me think about the first pieces of advice that people say for getting over kind of climate anxiety and environmental anxiety is, become active,
Yeah.
get involved. And it does seem to make a difference. And, we often ended our episodes in the first couple of seasons asking our guests, what brings them hope. And it's a bit of a cliche question. And funny enough, you were talking earlier about this election that we just had, and one of the phrases that came up out of the Democratic Party leading up to the election was, rather than cautious optimism, was nauseous optimism, right? So this idea that they're cautiously optimistic, but it's making them almost sick. And that turned out to be prescient. But I guess the question then for you is, how are we going to kind of incorporate this idea of optimism, and yes, cautious and hopefully not too nauseous optimism, but how are we going to incorporate that theme in this series?
Yeah, with the word like hope, hope is about the attitude we bring to the work we do, right? Feeling fulfilled in trying to build the better world that we would all like to see. And it doesn't have to hinge on outcomes. So these are the kind of conversations we can have, but certainly that's where Joanna Macy and Christopher Johnstone are coming from. That because we don't know what the outcomes are going to be, right? We like there's all this work, both pro sustainability and contra arguably. How it's all going to play out in the next 50 or 100 years, we just don't know, right? And so the hope can be in like building community among others who are doing the work and really feeling good about ourselves in doing it. And then we'll see what happens, right? But now that I think about, we often asked our podcast guests, what brings you hope? And a number of them said it's the next generation. I see what young people are doing in Extinction Rebellion and all the different movements, Greta Thunberg, and I say, wow, that's giving me hope that things are going to move on a different trajectory. I think that's true. On the other hand, I don't like the idea that we're just passing the buck to the next generation. That's not enough. We all got to do this work together. But on the subject of young people, I just want to signal that one other thing that we want to do this season is do a few episodes that really profile the work of our talented graduate students who are working on a wide variety of settings to address sustainability issues, often in pretty innovative and progressive ways. That work isn't easy, but it's definitely inspiring. It's been inspiring to me. And so I look forward to bringing some of their stories into the season of the podcast as well.
So stay tuned for that. Keep the Ecopolitics podcast on your podcast app and refresh every month as we roll out the season 4 this year. So keep apprised. And Peter, we should probably end it there. And I think we should end by thanking the team that helps put this podcast together. So we've got Kaylee McIntosh, who is producing this season and who also helped with the additional resources and other materials that were part of season 3. And Nicole Bedford, who is our amazing producer from seasons 1, 2, and 3, and is going to be editing this material for you. And of course, we cannot forget about the amazing artistic design support and technical support provided by Adam Gibbard, who's, I think all my students have become familiar with the amazing artwork that he's been doing, and it's real artwork. I gotta tell everyone it's not this AI generated stuff. And hey, Peter, that actually reminds me, maybe we should do an episode about the climate footprint of AI. Maybe season 5.
That'd be great.
Season 5, eh?
Okay, so stay tuned for season 5, but let's do number 4 first.
Okay.